Evangelia Astridou is a Greek legal professional and social anthropologist with an interdisciplinary career spanning law, gender studies, and digital policy. She holds a law degree from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, 2010, an MA in social anthropology, women and gender, from the University of the Aegean, 2014, and an MSc in law and informatics completed in 2024. Her academic work includes ethnographic research on ritual, communitas, and gender at the 2013 European Rainbow Gathering in Greece, as well as later research on gendered cyber violence and sexist hate speech. Professionally, she is a practicing appellate lawyer, accredited mediator, and registered member of the Alexandroupoli Bar Association, and she currently works as a labor inspector within the Greek Ministry of Labor, specializing in gender equality and digital law, combining public service with ongoing engagement in legal education and policy-oriented research. This Greek language paper, Welcome Home, Community and Tribe at a Rainbow Gathering, is a 2014 master's thesis based on fieldwork at a rainbow gathering in Greece, Grammos, that asks how a temporary communitas, an intense feeling of egalitarian togetherness, often contrasted with everyday Babylon society, is actually lived, and how gender reshapes, and is reshaped, by that experience. It first maps the concept of communitas through anthropology and political theory, then introduces the rainbow family and the study's methods, and finally analyzes daily practices, shared food, consensus councils, collective living, nudity and bodily routines, spirituality, and nonviolence, as techniques that try to suspend hierarchy and produce a utopian welcome home feeling. The core finding is that rainbow life can open real space for experimenting with roles and relationships, especially around the body and gender performance, but it does not magically erase power, gendered participation gaps, safety risks for women, and moments of conflict or coercion still appear, sometimes hidden by everyone is equal ideals. Overall, the thesis argues that the gathering functions as a historically specific, short-lived utopia where people test different ways of being together, with gender serving as a key lens that reveals both the possibilities and the limits of communitas in practice. The introduction sets out the thesis's central question: how communitas, understood as an intense, temporary experience of equality and togetherness, is produced, lived, and contested within the European Rainbow Gathering, and how gender shapes this experience. It situates the Rainbow Gathering as a contemporary, mobile, and explicitly anti-hierarchical community that positions itself against Babylon, or dominant social order, framing it as a fertile site for examining utopian social experimentation. The author explains her choice of ethnographic fieldwork and participant observation, emphasizing her own embodied participation in the gathering, and outlines her interest in everyday practices rather than idealized narratives. The introduction also signals the thesis's critical stance. While rainbow discourse celebrates equality, peace, and freedom, these ideals must be examined through gender, power, and embodiment to understand their limits as well as their possibilities. Finally, it briefly introduces the structure of the thesis and the theoretical lenses, anthropological, political, and feminist, that guide the analysis. This theory section lays out the conceptual framework the thesis uses to understand communitas by moving back and forth between philosophy, anthropology, politics, and feminist theory. It begins by tracing the idea of communitas from political philosophy into anthropology, focusing on how it describes moments of intense social togetherness that temporarily suspend hierarchy and structure, especially in ritual contexts. It then examines the political dimensions of communitas, exploring the tension between individual autonomy and collective belonging, and questioning whether communitas can function as a genuinely transformative political form, or whether it inevitably depends on, and reproduces, existing social structures. Finally, the section introduces feminist critiques, which challenge idealized notions of community by emphasizing embodiment, gender, nature, and power, and by showing how claims of equality often mask exclusions or inequalities. Together, these three subsections establish communitas as a dynamic, contested concept that must be analyzed through gender and power, rather than treated as a neutral or purely emancipatory social experience. The next section explains how the research was situated, designed, and carried out. It first provides historical and contextual background on the rainbow movement, outlining its origins, values, and transnational character, and situating the European Rainbow Gathering as a recurring event shaped by both global ideals and local conditions. It then describes the author's research methodology, centered on ethnographic participant observation during the 2013 gathering in Greece, along with informal conversations and reflexive field notes, emphasizing the challenges and ethical considerations of researching a temporary, non-institutional community. Finally, the section discusses the act of entering the gathering as a symbolic crossing into a heterotopic space, one marked by different rules, norms, and meanings than everyday society, highlighting how physical movement, rituals of entry, and sensory experiences signal the transition from Babylon to the rainbow world, and frame the researcher's position within it. The first subsection situates the research by outlining the historical emergence and broader context of the rainbow movement. It traces the origins of the rainbow family to countercultural movements of the late 1960s and early 1970s, highlighting its emphasis on peace, nonviolence, spiritual pluralism, ecological awareness, and radical equality. The subsection explains how rainbow gatherings function as temporary, non-commercial communities organized through consensus rather than formal leadership, and how European gatherings adapt these principles within different national and cultural settings. It also contextualizes the 2013 European Rainbow Gathering in Greece, noting the social, political, and economic climate in which it took place, and framing the gathering as both part of a global rainbow tradition and a locally situated response to contemporary crises. This background establishes the gathering as a historically grounded yet fluid social experiment that provides the setting for the ethnographic analysis that follows. This part situates the 2013 European Rainbow Gathering within the specific conditions of Greece, during a period of deep social and economic crisis marked by austerity measures, unemployment, political disillusionment, and widespread uncertainty following the sovereign debt crisis. The subsection explains that the gathering took place against a backdrop of strained state institutions, social fragmentation, and heightened public debate about solidarity, community, and alternative ways of living. Within this context, the Rainbow Gathering is framed not only as a continuation of a long-standing global countercultural tradition, but also as a locally meaningful response to contemporary Greek realities, offering participants a temporary space of mutual aid, non-monetary exchange, and collective care. The author emphasizes that the appeal of communitas at this moment cannot be separated from the broader crisis environment, as the gathering functioned both as an escape from, and a commentary on, the failures of dominant political and economic systems in Greece at the time. The second subsection outlines the research design and methodological choices used in the study, emphasizing ethnography as the most appropriate approach for understanding a temporary, experiential community like the Rainbow Gathering. The author explains that the research is based primarily on participant observation during the 2013 European Rainbow Gathering in Greece, where she lived within the camp and took part in its daily activities, rituals, and collective processes. Data were gathered through informal conversations, embodied participation, and detailed field notes rather than structured interviews, reflecting the gathering's anti-institutional ethos. The subsection also addresses reflexivity and ethics, acknowledging the researcher's dual role as participant and observer, the fluid boundaries between insiders and outsiders, and the limitations imposed by the gathering's temporality and resistance to formal documentation. The ethics discussion in this subsection focuses on the challenges of researching a temporary, non-hierarchical community that explicitly resists formal authority and documentation. The author explains that informed consent could not be treated as a one-time procedural act, but instead had to be negotiated continuously through presence, transparency, and respectful participation. She avoided recording devices and formal interviews, relying instead on observation and informal conversations in order to align with the gathering's values and to minimize intrusion. Anonymity is emphasized, with care taken not to identify individuals or disclose sensitive situations, especially given issues of vulnerability, gender, and conflict within the camp. The author also reflects on her dual role as participant and researcher, acknowledging ethical tensions between involvement and analysis, and framing reflexivity, awareness of her own position, emotions, and limits, as a central ethical practice rather than a methodological afterthought. The third subsection analyses the act of entering the rainbow gathering as a symbolic and experiential transition into a heterotopic space with its own norms, meanings, and social logic. The author describes how physical movement toward the gathering site, the absence of signage or formal entrances, and the welcoming greeting "Welcome Home" mark a gradual separation from Babylon and signal entry into an alternative social world. This crossing is not only spatial but also embodied and emotional, involving changes in behavior, appearance, speech, and expectations as participants adapt to communal living, non-monetary exchange, and consensus-based interaction. The subsection emphasizes that these symbolic boundaries are porous and continually negotiated, shaping both how participants experience communitas and how the researcher herself becomes positioned within the community as she moves between observer and participant. Section 3 examines how communitas is produced and experienced in everyday life at the rainbow gathering. It begins by describing the community not as a fixed group, but as a temporary gathering that comes into being through shared presence, collective labor, and informal social bonds. The section then explores the central role of healing discourse, showing how personal and collective healing is framed as both a spiritual and political project that justifies withdrawal from Babylon. It goes on to analyze rainbow traditions as practices that are presented as timeless, but are in fact continuously reinvented, helping stabilize communitas while maintaining its anti-institutional ethos. The discussion of spirituality and politics shows how utopia is performed through rituals, meditation, and symbolic acts that merge personal transformation with collective ideals. Finally, the section highlights how communitas is sustained through intense everyday interactions that celebrate difference and otherness, while also generating tensions, emotional labor, and subtle forms of regulation within the supposedly egalitarian space. The first subsection explains that the rainbow community is not understood as a stable or clearly bounded social group, but as something that comes into existence through the act of gathering itself. The author emphasizes that community is produced through physical co-presence, shared movement, collective work, and everyday interaction rather than through formal membership, rules, or leadership. Communitas emerges gradually as people arrive, set up camps, cook together, attend councils, and participate in rituals, making the gathering a process rather than a fixed entity. The subsection highlights how this temporary and fluid form of community challenges conventional ideas of social organization, while also depending on constant participation and cooperation to sustain the feeling of togetherness. The second subsection focuses on how healing operates as a central moral, emotional, and political call within the rainbow gathering. Healing is presented not only as individual self-care, but as a collective project aimed at repairing the damage caused by Babylon, understood as a violent, alienating social system. The author shows how physical, emotional, spiritual, and social forms of healing overlap through practices such as alternative therapies, communal support, ritual, and shared narratives of trauma and recovery. Healing discourse helps legitimize withdrawal from mainstream society and frames participation in the gathering as a transformative process, while also creating expectations about behavior, vulnerability, and emotional openness. At the same time, the subsection suggests that this emphasis on healing can subtly regulate participation, privileging certain experiences and expressions while marginalizing others within the supposedly egalitarian space. The third subsection examines how traditions at the rainbow gathering help produce and stabilize communitas, even though the movement rejects formal structures and fixed authority. The author shows that practices such as councils, shared meals, rituals, greetings, and songs are presented as timeless and natural, but are in fact continuously recreated and negotiated by participants. These traditions provide a sense of continuity and collective identity across different gatherings, allowing newcomers to quickly learn how to participate and belong. At the same time, framing practices as tradition gives them moral weight, making them harder to question and subtly regulating behavior within the community. The The subsection argues that rainbow traditions function as flexible but powerful tools that both sustain the feeling of egalitarian togetherness and introduce informal norms and expectations into everyday life. The fourth subsection explores how the rainbow gathering enacts utopia through practices that blur the boundaries between spirituality and politics. The author argues that activities such as meditation, prayer, ritual, and spiritual discourse are not separate from political life, but function as political acts that express resistance to hierarchy, capitalism, and institutional authority. Spiritual practices are framed as tools for personal transformation that are believed to lead to broader social change, making inner change and collective politics mutually reinforcing. By living according to ideals of peace, harmony, and unity, participants perform a vision of an alternative society in the present rather than demanding change through conventional political means. The subsection shows that utopia at the gathering is not a distant goal but something enacted through everyday spiritual political practices, even as this performance remains temporary and fragile. The fifth subsection examines how difference and otherness are actively performed and managed through the intense rhythms of everyday life at the rainbow gathering. The author shows that constant proximity, emotional openness, and shared living create heightened interactions in which identities, beliefs, and personal boundaries are continuously exposed. While the gathering celebrates diversity and nonconformity as core values, this intensity also produces friction, misunderstandings, and informal pressures to conform to rainbow norms. Everyday practices, such as how people speak, express emotions, handle conflict, or display spirituality, become political acts that mark who fully belongs and who is seen as disruptive or out of place. The subsection argues that communitas is sustained through these performances of otherness, but that they also reveal the subtle power relations and exclusions operating within an ostensibly egalitarian community. Chapter 4 shows how communitas at the rainbow gathering is deeply shaped by gender, even when the community claims to be beyond hierarchy and social roles. It follows gendered experience from the journey to the gathering, on the road, where safety, mobility and vulnerability are not shared equally, into the camp itself, where space becomes gendered through who occupies which areas, who feels comfortable where, and how bodies are watched or protected, gendered geographies. The section then analyzes how the community's political and spiritual language often relies on metaphysical ideas about masculine and feminine energies, which can repackage gender norms as spiritual truths rather than social constructions. It also explores how past experiences and semi-conscious habits travel into the gathering, so participants may reproduce familiar gender expectations even while trying to escape them. Finally, the section critiques appeals to nature and natural bodies, showing how claims that gender differences are natural can reinforce conventional assumptions about sexuality, embodiment, and roles, revealing that gender remains a key site where the limits of rainbow equality become visible. The first subsection examines the journey to the rainbow gathering as the first point where gendered differences become visible, challenging the idea that communitas begins only upon arrival. The author shows that travel on the road is experienced unevenly, with women facing greater risks related to safety, harassment, and dependence on others for transportation, especially in hitchhiking and remote travel conditions. These experiences shape expectations, emotional states, and strategies of self-protection before entering the gathering itself. The subsection argues that gendered vulnerability and mobility already structure participation before communitas is formed, demonstrating that broader social inequalities travel with participants and influence how freely and securely different bodies can access the supposedly egalitarian space. The second subsection analyses how space within the rainbow gathering becomes implicitly gendered, despite the community's claims of openness and equality. The author shows that different areas of the camp, such as kitchens, healing spaces, sleeping areas, and paths, are used, occupied, and experienced differently, depending on gender, shaping feelings of safety, visibility, and belonging. Women tend to navigate space more cautiously, often forming informal protective networks, or avoiding certain places and times, while men are more likely to move freely and claim central or public areas. These spatial patterns are not officially organized, but emerge through everyday practices, bodily presence, and unspoken norms. The subsection argues that communitas is therefore mapped unevenly onto space, revealing how gendered power relations are reproduced through the physical and social geography of the gathering. The third subsection examines how the rainbow gathering's political and spiritual discourse gives the community itself a gendered character. The author shows that ideas of harmony, care, peace, and emotional openness are often framed through metaphysical notions of feminine and masculine energies, presenting the community as spiritually feminine in contrast to the aggressive, rational, and patriarchal qualities attributed to Babylon. While this framing supports critiques of domination and violence, it also risks naturalizing gender binaries and associating certain values with fixed gendered essences. The subsection argues that by spiritualizing gender in this way, the gathering transforms political ideals into metaphysical truths, making them harder to question and potentially reproducing gender hierarchies even within a space committed to equality. The fourth subsection explores how participants' past experiences and deeply ingrained habits continue to shape gendered behavior within the rainbow gathering, often at a semi-conscious level. The author argues that even in a space that promotes radical equality and self-awareness, people carry with them embodied memories, learned roles, and emotional patterns formed in mainstream society. These pasts surface in interactions, expectations, and reactions, such as how intimacy, authority, care, or conflict are handled, without always being explicitly acknowledged. The subsection shows that communitas does not erase history. Instead, it provides a setting where these internalized patterns may be temporarily softened, exposed, or renegotiated, but not fully undone. In this way, gendered power relations persist not only through visible structures, but through habits and dispositions that operate beneath conscious intention. The fifth subsection examines how appeals to nature are used within the rainbow gathering to explain and justify social relations, especially around gender. The author shows that participants often invoke nature as a moral reference point, associating closeness to the earth, simplicity, and authenticity with freedom from social constraints. However, these ideas of nature are frequently gendered, linking women to nurturing, emotional, or bodily qualities and men to strength, protection, or activity. By framing gender differences as natural rather than social, such discourse can obscure power relations and make inequalities appear inevitable or harmless. The subsection argues that while nature is central to the rainbow critique of modern society, it can also function as a depoliticizing concept that limits critical reflection on gendered assumptions within the community. The sixth subsection focuses on how bodies at the rainbow gathering are interpreted and regulated through ideas of natural gender. The author shows that practices such as nudity, bodily freedom, sexuality, and physical closeness are often framed as a return to natural ways of being, supposedly free from social constraint. However, these interpretations tend to rely on normative assumptions about male and female bodies, desire, and behavior, which can place uneven expectations and pressures on women's bodies in particular. While bodily openness is presented as liberating and egalitarian, it can also produce discomfort, vulnerability, and unequal exposure. The subsection argues that by treating gendered bodies as naturally given rather than socially shaped, the gathering risks reproducing familiar gender hierarchies even as it seeks to transcend them. Chapter 5 uses a gendered case study to show how the rainbow gathering attempts to immunize itself against conflict and violence, while simultaneously limiting its ability to address them critically. The author first examines how violence is conceptualized within the community, where it is often understood narrowly as overt physical aggression and treated as something external to communitas, rather than as something that can emerge internally through power imbalances, coercion, or gendered vulnerability. She then turns to the sanctification of the Greek family, analyzing how dominant cultural narratives about family, protection, and morality shape reactions to gendered violence, even within an alternative setting. Together, the subsections demonstrate that efforts to preserve harmony and purity within communitas can lead to denial, silencing, or moral framing of conflict, revealing how broader social norms around gender and violence continue to structure responses even in spaces committed to radical equality. The first subsection examines how violence is defined and understood within the rainbow gathering. arguing that the community's commitment to peace and nonviolence narrows what is recognized as violence in practice. The author shows that violence is usually conceptualized as explicit physical aggression or intentional harm, allowing subtler forms, such as emotional pressure, intimidation, boundary violations, or gendered coercion, to be minimized or rendered invisible. By framing communitas as inherently peaceful, the gathering tends to treat violence as something external, brought in from Babylon, rather than as something that can emerge within the community itself. This conceptualization makes it difficult to acknowledge harm when it occurs, particularly in gendered contexts, and contributes to silencing or misrecognition of victims in order to preserve the image of harmony and unity. The second subsection analyzes how dominant cultural ideas about the Greek family shape understandings of gender, protection, and morality within the rainbow gathering. The author shows that the family is implicitly treated as a sacred and protective institution, associated with care, honor, and moral authority, especially in discussions involving women and violence. When conflicts or harmful situations arise, responses are often filtered through this familial logic, emphasizing protection, reconciliation, or moral judgment rather than structural analysis of power and responsibility. As a result, gendered violence can be reframed as a private or moral issue rather than a political one, limiting open discussion and accountability. The subsection argues that even within an alternative, anti-institutional community, deeply rooted cultural narratives about the family continue to influence how harm is interpreted and managed, reinforcing traditional gender roles and silencing critical engagement. The conclusion brings together the thesis's findings by arguing that the rainbow gathering functions as a temporary, historically situated experiment in communitas rather than a space that fully transcends social power. Drawing on ethnographic evidence, the author shows that while the gathering creates meaningful experiences of equality, belonging, and collective care, these experiences are fragile, uneven, and deeply shaped by gender, embodiment, and cultural histories. Gender emerges as a key analytical lens that reveals how ideals of harmony, nature, healing, and nonviolence can both enable alternative ways of living and obscure inequalities, vulnerabilities, and conflict. The conclusion emphasizes that communitas should not be understood as a pure or universal condition, but as a process marked by tension, contradiction, and negotiation. Ultimately, the thesis argues that the political significance of the rainbow gathering lies not in offering a perfected utopia, but in exposing both the possibilities and the limits of trying to live equality in the present. The journey to the gathering begins long before arrival. Travel itself is uncertain, slow, and unevenly experienced. Moving on the road involves hitchhiking, waiting, trusting strangers, and navigating unfamiliar terrain. For the author, the road already reveals gendered vulnerability, moments of caution, dependence on others for rides, the need to assess safety constantly. The gathering is anticipated as a destination of equality and care, yet access to it is shaped by the same inequalities participants hope to leave behind. By the time the author approaches the site, exhaustion, anticipation, and guarded openness coexist. There is no formal entrance to the gathering, no sign announcing arrival. The crossing happens gradually, marked by the thinning of roads, the density of forest, the appearance of tents, smoke from cooking fires, and people moving barefoot along paths. Someone says "Welcome home," a phrase that immediately reframes the space as intimate and belonging, even for newcomers. This greeting carries emotional weight. It signals entry into a different social world, one opposed to Babylon, the name participants give to mainstream society. The author experiences this moment not as a clear rupture, but as a slow shift in posture, attention, and expectation. Daily life unfolds through shared routines rather than schedules. People cook together in communal kitchens, contribute food when they can, and eat without money changing hands. The author observes how labor is organized informally. Some people consistently cook, others gather wood, some drift between tasks. Decision-making happens in councils, where participants sit in circles, pass a talking stick, and aim for consensus. The process is slow, emotionally charged, and often frustrating, yet it is treated as a moral practice rather than an efficient one. Silence, Repetition and effect matter as much as words. Healing is everywhere. There are designated healing areas, but the language of healing extends beyond them. People speak openly about personal trauma, exhaustion, illness, and emotional pain. The author witnesses how stories of suffering circulate easily, creating intimacy between strangers. Healing practices range from massage and alternative therapies to prayer, meditation, and collective chanting. Healing is framed as both personal and political. Participants present their presence at the gathering as a way to repair themselves and the world simultaneously. At the same time, the author notices how this emphasis creates expectations to be open, to be vulnerable, to be working on oneself that not everyone can or wants to meet. The gathering feels intensely embodied. Bodies are close, often uncovered, always visible. Nudity is normalized and described as natural and liberating, yet the author experiences and observes how this freedom is uneven. Women's bodies draw attention differently, producing moments of discomfort, exposure, and negotiation. The author notes how women adapt by moving in groups, choosing sleeping places carefully, and avoiding certain areas at night. Men, by contrast, appear to move more freely through space. These patterns are not officially acknowledged, yet they quietly structure everyday movement. Space itself carries meaning. Kitchens, councils, healing tents, sleeping areas, and paths develop gendered uses over time. The author maps how some places feel welcoming and safe, while others feel charged or risky depending on time of day and who is present. These gendered geographies emerge without formal rules, shaped instead by habit, reputation, and shared knowledge passed through whispers and glances. Communitas exists, but it is unevenly distributed across bodies and spaces. Conflict is rare in explicit form, but tension is constant. Disagreements arise in councils, around consent, around behavior that makes others uncomfortable. When problems surface, the community often responds by emphasizing peace, unity, and nonviolence. The author observes how this framing can make it difficult to name harm, especially when it does not fit narrow definitions of violence. Emotional pressure, boundary violations, and fear are sometimes absorbed into calls for harmony rather than addressed directly. The desire to protect the image of communitas can silence critique. Cultural histories travel with participants. Greek ideas about family, protection, morality, and gender surface in moments of crisis, even within this explicitly anti-institutional space. The author sees how the language of family can sanctify certain responses, protecting, reconciling, moralizing, while limiting political analysis of responsibility and power. The gathering does not exist outside culture, it rearranges it temporarily. As days pass, intensity accumulates. Constant proximity, emotional openness, and lack of privacy create both closeness and exhaustion. The author experiences moments of deep connection alongside withdrawal and fatigue. Communitas is real, but fragile. It requires constant labor, emotional, physical, ethical, to sustain. When the gathering begins to dissolve, people leave as they arrived, gradually, unevenly, carrying what they can. The site is cleaned, traces are removed, and the forest is restored as much as possible. What remains is not a permanent community, but memory, affect, and altered perception. The author leaves with a sharpened awareness that the gathering did not abolish hierarchy or gendered power, but it did expose them, soften them in moments, and make them visible in new ways. Through the author's eyes, the 2013 European Rainbow Gathering in Greece appears as a temporary experiment in living otherwise, one that produces real warmth, care, and belonging, while also revealing how deeply gender, history, and power are woven into even the most egalitarian dreams.